My junior high school counselor routine of counting to make sure we are all here. I'm just going to trust that everyone is. Yes. All those who aren't present, raise your hands. All right. Are there a few more coming, Prez? All right. Well, I think in the interest of time, we may need to go ahead and get on with things. But again, let me welcome you. There are the Anderses, and Kathy, I'll hold for a second. I ought to be able to tell a pulpit joke, but yeah. Baptist, yes. We could tell Baptist jokes tonight because this is a gathering of Methodists, isn't it? There were 3 Methodists who went to the Rangers game last week, and we forgot to check the identity of the 4th in the party, and we were telling all kinds of nasty things about the Baptists, and then it occurred to me, maybe our guest is a Baptist. I needed to watch my tongue. Good. I'm glad you are all here. It's great to be gathered in God's name and in God's Spirit as God's people, and it is good to gather as the people called Methodists. There is a lot of diversity present in the room tonight. We are diverse in terms of age and place from which we come. There are multi-generational families present with us tonight, so sometimes Methodism goes way, way back. The Del Rosario family and parts thereof. There are at least 3 generations of you present tonight, aren't there, Gigi? Which is wonderful, very exciting. And some of us are relatively new to Methodism. We come to Methodism from other traditions, including the Baptist Church, and we are always delighted to welcome you. Yes, it is a very good place to be from. I think the joke among the Presbyterians are Methodists are Baptists who can read. Yes, and Presbyterians are Methodists whose stocks paid off. Yes, right, I know. I'm on a roll. I play here every Sunday morning at 10:15. It really is a delight, not only to welcome you tonight, but to welcome my friend, the Reverend Dr. Ted Campbell. The great thing about getting to be pastor and thus the person who chooses whom to invite is I get to invite who I want, and that generally means I invite my friends because I think I know a lot of interesting people. And Ted ranks foremost among the interesting people that I know. But Ted is also the example par excellence of what it means to be a faithful scholar and churchman. Because Ted is ordained as an elder in the United Methodist Church and has pastored churches and has pursued a tremendously successful academic career. So Ted is a product of Lon Morris College, where he met Dale. So we have every reason in the world to be grateful to Lon Morris College, a wonderful Methodist institution, sadly no longer extant. Yeah, and your parents met there as well? Yeah, Lon Morris is responsible for a lot of great things in Methodism. Methodist Breeding Ground, exactly. After he finished his degree at Lon Morris, Ted moved to North Texas from Beaumont, where he is from, studied at the University of North Texas, go Mean Green, studied at Oxford, and finished his career at Southern Methodist University. Right, so Ted has taught at a number of Methodist institutions. It may be easier to name those where you have not taught, but too many, yes. But Ted has taught at places like the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. He was president of Garrett Theological Seminary in Chicago. He taught at Duke Divinity School. Must have been the height of your career. Right. But then he had the ill grace to come to Perkins, where he ended his career as the Albert C. Outler Professor of Wesleyan Studies. Very recently retired as of 22 days ago. I was going to say like 3 weeks ago, yeah. But of course, church historians, like old soldiers, never die. They just keep working, right? So Ted is a historian at heart. And he's written any number of histories. So many of the histories that I read tend to be histories about John Wesley or the Methodist Church. But Ted has wide-ranging interests, including neighborhoods here in Dallas. And you can go to his YouTube channel and find some of the videos you've made about the people who populate neighborhoods here in Dallas. Ted is now working on, well, what's your next project? You told me and I've forgotten.
A history of my native Southeast Texas.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I'm doing. Yeah.
So Ted is writing about the Beaumont region. So now sometimes you can say to people, we've invited a church historian, and you just see them trying to work up some polite response, right? Like, oh, I'm sure that will be very interesting. But Ted, as I've said now any number of times, is from East Texas. So he can make anything interesting, including church history. But church history is interesting because it is the story of God's people as they seek to be faithful to God's call. And we are blessed because we are the people called Methodists. We have a distinct history and heritage, and Ted may touch on that briefly. But Ted really has 3 different subjects that he wants to talk with us about over the course of the next 3 nights. So without much further ado, because I'm in danger of taking all of your time, let me welcome my friend, the Reverend Dr. Ted Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Look at this. I am an SMU professor, so in case the SMU fashion police ask, I did wear the blazer, okay? Everybody? Cool. Thank you. And there it is. So I'm delighted to be here. This is the Mother Church. This is the oldest Christian church of any denomination in the Dallas area. This is the original Christian community in the Dallas, Texas area, and it's a great thing. I mean, that you're still going since January 1844, when Isaac Webb called his neighbors in the colony here to come together and meet at the home of Richard Cochran. William Cochran. No, it was William Cochran, that one. And there's been a Methodist community between here and and Farmers Branch, where Webb settled, for all of that long space of history. So this is a really important church, and I love this building. I love the spirit. I like your cemetery. I love dead people. I'm a historian. I hang around with dead people all the time. I'm cool with that. And I want to tell you some challenging stories over the next 3 nights. So the question is, are we there yet? And really what we mean is not just what kids say, you know, when you're on a trip. And I remember asking my parents that over and over, are we there yet? You know, that sort of thing. But to be specific, are we yet over the divisive problems that we as a church have faced in recent years, especially in the United Methodist Church? Well, it feels like we're over it. Really, the whole denomination feels better now. Church meetings are so much more positive, so much more less divisive than they had been for the last 20 to 30 years. Honest to goodness, the bishop told me, my bishop is in Houston. I'm from that area. And Bishop Cynthia told us, she said that she was just shocked the first annual conference where we didn't have somebody asking, well, what do you mean when you say this word, blah, 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 or something, you know, with a really angry tone to their voice. It's just been not quite a love feast, perhaps, but it's a good feeling. Less divisive than they have been. So the answer is probably yes for most of the divisive issues, but I think it's an important moment to take stock by trying to tell where we were and where we are now as we look to the future. So I want to interpret 3 challenges for the United Methodist Church. Tonight I'm going to talk about something that we were all talking about before the next one came along, and that was membership decline and generational changes in the United Methodist Church all the way from the middle 20th century. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Tomorrow night, we get to talk about sex. And Methodists aren't very good at it, really. I mean, you know, we don't do that. Sorry, we don't do that sort of thing. But we got to, because that's been one of the more divisive issues, and how we've sort of come to some kind of agreement, yet an agreement that led to a major division in the church. We've lost 25% of our congregations, our clergy, our members in the last few years over this set of issues, and I want to try to make some sense of that. And then there's a new crisis growing. I'm going to call it a crisis of Catholicity, a very technical term that Jeff knows, but it's really about globalization and regionalization, and we are becoming a different church. In the past, the United Methodist Church has been basically a United States church that had some congregations elsewhere in the world. And finally, we're going to become a church in which the United States is not the majority member. In fact, it hasn't been for the last few years. But we're going to redo the structure of the church so that the United States is not privileged in the way we organize the church. That's what globalization and regionalization is about. And I'm going to tell you, I'm part of the group that's kind of studying that and looking at it, so I can give you a kind of insider's view of that. But tonight, I want to talk about this issue of membership decline and generational changes in the United Methodist Church, in the United States especially, from the middle of the 20th century. Now, I'm a storyteller, and I have no notes in front of me except what you have there. So I'm going to try to tell a story following my notes here, but I want to tell a complicated story. All good stories are complicated stories. Did somebody ever tell you a story that said, once there was a good little girl and everything she did was good and everybody loved her? Well, why? I mean, what's going on? What's wrong with this story, okay? This is not that kind of story. This is a complicated story. I'm writing a history of Southeast Texas. You know, we all got the Texas history in the 4th grade and the 7th grade. It all started with Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston and the Battle of San Jacinto and the Runaway Scrape and all that stuff. They didn't tell us anything about the people who were here before that. And I've come to know a good deal about that, and I'm going to get to tell some of that story in touch with descendants. One of the things we were told was the people were Karankawa, and then they all died off as a result of smallpox, and what else did they tell about them? And they were cannibals. Yeah, that's what they said. Every single one of those is wrong, okay? They weren't Karankawa, they were Hatakapa or Ishak people. They were not cannibals. Cannibal is what they called each other, like guys call each other in the gym, and it's not nice. But they did not all die off. And I'm pleased to be in touch with descendants of the Atakapa Ishak people of Southeast Texas. But it's a complicated story. I've got a graveyard in my family. And the oldest grave is something we didn't know about until I started poking around. She's the oldest grave there. She was a French woman, and yet her husband, as it turns out, was a very important guy in Texas history. Her husband was a man named William Ashmore. He was a free black man, and he was rich. He was wealthy. He had power in Texas. Some of the Texas people, when the Texas Republic was formed, they tried to pass a law that said all free black people have to leave within 3 years or they'll be sold into slavery. And the white neighbors of William Ashmore went to Austin and convinced Governor Lamar that they needed to rescind that law, and they rescinded it, and the rescinding it was called the Ashmore Acts in Texas. So it's a fascinating story to me, not the sort of thing I thought was in my family cemetery, but I want to tell a complicated story with responsibility to historical evidence. That's what makes me a member of the Guild. With fairness to people engaged in these stories. Each of these 3 stories are stories that are being told now, but they're often being told by partisans, and it's problematic because they're not, I think, giving a fair account, and I'm going to try to do that, even though I'm partisan myself. I mean, I come down on particular positions in all of these different issues, but I'm going to try to tell a fair story. John Wesley said, he preached a sermon on the cure of evil speaking. And he defined evil speaking as speaking ill, speaking badly about anyone who's not present. Got it? In other words, you can say anything you want critical to a person if you say it to their face. And if you're not willing to say it to their face, you shut up. That was the old Methodist ethos. Imagine what it would be like if politicians in the United States of all parties followed a rule like that, okay? So I want to tell responsible stories in fairness to the people engaged at this, responsible and illuminating stories that illuminate our current reality. And I do this because I know very well that Christians have a very, very bad history of misrepresenting other Christian groups. And in the last few years, as we've had a division in the United Methodist Church, I can see how it feels. I used to talk about the earlier divisions among Methodists. There was this group, and they believed this, and there was this group, and they believed this, and they just agreed to sort of form a new church and so forth. That's not the way it worked, okay? The way it worked was, it was nasty. They told nasty stories about each other, and they got mad, and it took 2 to 3 generations of old ticked off people dying off before anybody could get back together. So I know that now, but I want to tell a story that's problematic. And this is tonight going to be about the story of membership decline. I'm sure you've heard about that. Generational changes in the United Methodist Church in the United States from the mid-20th century. It's a tough story to tell because it framed our life for about 30 years now. Every meeting we went to, people had a reason why the denomination was declining. And not to make too fine a point of it, but whatever their pet peeve was, that was the reason why the denomination was declining. They were sure about that. It led to what I call the long blame game for about 30 or 40 years now, trying to assess who was responsible or what was responsible for the decline of the United Methodist Church. I'm going to give you a very different perspective on that this evening. And it wasn't just the United Methodist Church. In fact, it was the whole family of what we called, well, the older Protestant churches in the United States, what we used to call mainline churches. Now that's a nasty word. What that means is it's about the Philadelphia, and there was a main line of trains that went out west from the city of Philadelphia, and that's where all what my grandmother would call the flusy suburbs were out there. And main line meant you had pretensions to be some of the grand people. Well, Methodists weren't grand at first. Methodists were kind of homely people, but they wanted to feel like they were part of that group. Methodists and Baptists both, to tell the truth. That makes this all a difficult story to tell. It framed Methodist life. It led to the blame game. It wasn't just Methodists, it was the others. And it consistently ignored what had come just before the period of decline that they described. And that changes the story. I think it drastically changes the story, and that's what I want to tell you about. Dean Robinson, somehow I think that name is wrong. Dean something or another. He wasn't a dean. His name was Dean. You name your boy Dean, right? And he was a United Methodist working for the National Council of Churches in the United States. His name was Dean Kelly. Okay, so I got to change that. His name was Dean Kelly, and he was working for the National Council of Churches, and he was kind of a statistician, and he was looking at numbers. The National Council of Churches sort of tracks every year, puts out a book about what churches have, how many members, and so on and so forth. And he came out in 1972, the year I graduated from high school, so yes, you can date me from that time, with a book called Why Conservative Churches Are Growing. And what he said was that the older churches in the United States, he called them ecumenical churches because they were involved in ecumenical discussions with each other. He said that these churches had begun to decline and lose members, and conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist churches were growing. This was met with utter scorn from leaders of Methodist, Episcopal, Lutheran. You've got to be wrong. You are dead wrong. We know how to build churches. We've successfully built all these great suburban churches since World War II. We are the winners, and you're saying they're gaining on us. And as it turns out, by the time he died in the 1990s, his scholarship was thoroughly vindicated. He was absolutely right. That change was going on as much as our leaders in that time were really trying hard not to see what was going on. And his continuing work set the stage for a long-lasting debate about conservative evangelical groups and why they were growing and why older denominations were declining. So in this case, I'm not going to talk just about United Methodist, but the whole family of old line or mainline, some people say sideline churches, Protestant churches in the United States. The terms are, the words are deprecated and they are often disavowed, but churches, this is what we mean. Churches that originated in the colonial period or maybe shortly after the colonial period in North America, they typically reflect historic Western Protestant forms of doctrine and of Christian worship. I'm going to give you a list in a minute or two, but they're contrasted with these evangelical churches like most Southern Baptist churches, like Pentecostal and holiness churches that have a kind of different ethos and originated, well, not the Baptists, but the other ones originated really after the time of the American Revolution and from the 1840s, say. Old line churches, I prefer to say old line Protestant churches, they took what we call a post-millennial social progressive outlook. Now that's going to take more time than we probably give it justice, but what they believed is that Jesus would not return until after a 1,000-year period. Now there's a millennium spoken of in the Revelation to St. John the Divine. And they believed that that millennium was going to be a period of progress in which we purify the earth and we make it the right place for Christ to come reign. They were post-millennial. Christ will not come until after the millennium. Well, the other group that began to be popular right around the turn of the 20th century. Y'all remember the 20th century? I was born in that century. This other group said, no, we've read the Scriptures, we understand the Scriptures, and what the Scriptures really say is Jesus is going to come at the beginning of that 1,000-year period that hasn't started yet, and at that point he is going to rapture the true churches and true Christians up to heaven, and that's going to happen next week. Mark my words, next week. We've done all the calculations. We know what's going to happen. We've got every single part of Daniel and Revelation and Mark 13 all figured out, Matthew 25. It all correlates. We can put it on a map around the top of the Sunday school room. This is what's going to happen, and Jesus is going to return. You don't need to build schools. You don't need to build hospitals. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to be packing food for people in Dallas, for heaven's sake. You don't need to do that. Jesus will return and rapture the church up to heaven, and what you got to do is save everybody you can and tell them they need to repent right now. Can I get an amen? Amen. Well, no, you're not supposed to say amen to that, because the Methodists said, no, really. Because they said, no, Jesus is not coming soon. Now, let me tell you something. Even though you said amen to that, they were wrong. And I mean, literally, they were wrong. Jesus did not come soon, did he? Right. Huh? You haven't seen him. Yeah, I haven't seen him. Yeah, well, good. Well, that's concrete historical evidence, you see. They were wrong, and I think they misled believers. While Methodists were out building Southern Methodist universities and Lon Morris College and places like that, and churches and social service agencies, these other groups were saying, well, you shouldn't be really doing any of that kind of stuff. But it was a big debate. They were post-millennially, socially progressive. They were involved in the ecumenical movement. They were talking to other churches, trying to overcome some of our differences. They were involved in what we call the social gospel movement. It was a New York Baptist who started that. A German Baptist. Can you imagine that? All the Baptists in East Texas, well, none of them are German that I knew, but German Baptist, Walter Rauschenbusch in New York City, and he said, you know, we need to save people's souls for sure, but these people are starving. We can't tell them the Word of God without actually helping where they are. And the social gospel was this movement to respond to the inner cities of our growing urban centers in the United States. These churches were involved positively in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Oh, I know they're dying off now, but the ministers in my conference who, in the 1960s, were students at Perkins School of Theology, and they'd get in their cars and drive over to Birmingham, Alabama, so they could march with Dr. King. And other places where the marches were going on. Selma, several of them marched at Selma with Dr. King because they took that progressive view. This is why the evangelical churches are saying, no, that's not important. Jesus is going to come soon, and so forth. So our churches were also influenced very much by the feminist movement in the 1970s. Perkins School of Theology almost doubled the number of students at that time because many women felt they had been called into ministry before, but they didn't come until the women's movement began around 1972. So there's a kind of similarity between all these churches. What I mean is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, that's one of our sister churches in the Methodist family, very prominent in this area. It's the 10th Episcopal District of the AME Church, and they have a bishop here in Dallas. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, that's not quite the same. They were a little more suspicious of bishops. Can you imagine that? Methodists who are suspicious of bishops. The American Baptist churches, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the CME Church, is also very strong in this area. The Cooperative Baptist Church Fellowship, brand new. These are the come-outers from the Southern Baptist Convention who have taken more traditional views of worship, actually, but also more progressive stances on social issues. The Episcopal Church in the United States, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Presbyterian Church in the USA, the Reformed Church in America, United Church of Christ, and the largest of them all, the United Methodist Church, right? And then denominations that are now being derived from these, and probably the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and some National Baptist congregations as well, especially the progressive National Baptist churches that really became separate because they wanted to follow Dr. King's vision of civil rights. So the rumors that have been going around is that there is this, right now, we're just on the brink of a horrifying mainline meltdown portending the death of all the historic Protestant churches. The rumor is that the evangelical churches are now eclipsing the old line, mainline, sideline churches, and they're drawing members away from us. I love that picture. It's actually a United Methodist Church in Gary, Indiana, that was fallen down and filled with snow at the time they took that picture. Now, that's the image the press has. Honestly, we had a program at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary when I was there, and we were conducting a boot camp in religion for journalists. And we would take them into a church, and we would say, now, this is what we call the pulpit. And they'd say, how do you spell that? What is it? P-U-L-P-I. And this is the where's the baptistry, Jeff? There's the baptistry. Oh, does that mean you're Baptist? No. And they didn't know nothing, okay? Excuse me, they did not know anything. The ignorance was just remarkable. And this was the summer of 9/11 that was followed by September 11th, right, 2001. And the immense ignorance of the press about religion was shown, right? They didn't know what was going on. It was really, really remarkable. And a woman from Dallas, what's her name? She'd been on the staff at Dallas Theological Seminary, and she was then the only religion news reporter for a major U.S. network. Peggy Waymeyer. Yeah, Peggy Waymeyer was fired that summer because they said, that's irrelevant. We don't need reporting about religion. And then 9/11 happened, right? So this is the story that's out there, is that we're declining, we're dying, and so forth. And it's based on some of these studies. I'm going to tell you about some of these studies. You don't need to write all this stuff down. There's not going to be an exam on this. I'm just going to go through and give you an idea of what they're talking about. This is a Pew Charitable Trust Pew Forum study, Religious Landscape 2008. And it showed that since year 2000, remember Y2K, we were all worried about our computers blowing up and stuff, that showed declining religious self-identification in the United States and the rise of what they called the religiously unaffiliated people. When they called them up on telephones that used to have little cords that came down and plugged into the wall, and when they later began having computer-based studies, they asked, what is your religious affiliation? And what they discovered was that lots and lots more people by that time said none, N-O-N-E. So we talk about the rise of the nones, the religiously affiliated people. Consistent declines in Christian self-identification, as it turned out, were largely Protestant, but this is what was not reported so much. The data actually showed it was evangelical as well as old-line Protestant churches that were declining. The Pew headline was about 3 in 10 United States adults are now religiously unaffiliated, 2021. I'm going to say something about that in a few minutes, try to give you my stereotyping impression of what that was really about. Another thing was a study of church membership. So I tried to do this on my own, and this is where I discovered the other side of the story that I think they were really not getting. I looked at all these denominations for which I could find accurate information from the Association of Religion Data Archives, and I put them all together, and it was very problematic because, you know, the United Methodist Church, like if you see, I tried to give membership in 1925, 1950, 1975, and then year 2000. Well, the United Methodist Church in 1975 was the United Methodist Church, but in 1950 it was called the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church, and in 1925 it was the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, the Methodist Protestant Church, the Evangelical Church, and the United Brethren in Christ. So I had to amalgamate all those together, and the Lutherans were the most horrible because they had a different evangelical Lutheran denomination on every other street corner in Minneapolis and places like that. So more stereotyping going on here. I love it. But when I put all this together, I came up with these totals that you see here. So in 1925, there were about 18 million Americans in these old-line churches, mainline churches. By 1950, this is the thing that shocked me, it's 25,000. By 1975, it's 27, really right at 28. This is 25 million, 28 million. And then 24 million by Y2K. Okay? Now, Dean Kelly had only been looking at figures from the 1970s through the 2000s. So if you put that in a chart and you graph it out, it doesn't really look like a horrible collision and meltdown is going to occur. That's literally what it's going to look like. But what some people were doing was funny work with graphs where you put the zero line here, and then it makes this dramatic thing that looks like next week there won't be any more Episcopalians or Methodists or Presbyterians in the United States because it looks like it's a straight line down. And that's what fed a lot of those stories. It was a misleading graphic. What they thought, what they just presumed, was that if you could push it back, you would see the same pattern, consistent decline. It's what I call the horror fantasy membership, but it had no data behind it except that last little part of it there. When I did the data and took my data together, this is what I came up with in the blue line, not the gray line that is the horror fantasy line. And what really happened, and this is rather well documented, is that at the middle of the 20th century, there was a remarkable, unprecedented rise in church memberships. It turns out most Americans were not members of churches at the beginning of the 20th century. It turns out that we've always said, why was it that Abraham Lincoln never joined a church, right? He actually was a member of the Methodist Mission Society, and they have his membership card at Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. But it turns out he was the norm, not the exception. So we'd been imagining that Protestants were all these churches, and every Sunday everybody in town got up and went to church. And it turns out now this is a technical term, it's bullshit, okay? It's just not true. And I think if they'd seen this kind of graph, they would have seen. And one of the things I'm going to say that went along with this remarkably fast gaining of new members, it's right in about the period of the Billy Graham revival. And so what Methodists and Presbyterians and others began doing was they came up with this thing where at the end of the service they'd say, if you want to join our church, just come forward and we'll make you a member and give you a little membership card or a membership certificate or something like that. And many of them never came back, but that's the rise that you get, I think, is accounted for by something like that. Now, historical and contextual factors. How long are we going here? 3 hours? 4?
Yes.
No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding. 24 minutes more?
20 minutes more.
Okay. All right.
25.
Yep. The growth in the United States population from the 1890s through the 1950s was largely from non-Protestant countries. Central and Eastern Europe, Italy, and Ireland. The largest religious groups coming into the United States were Catholic, Jewish, and Eastern Orthodox. Now, Methodists had this lovely fantasy that when all these different groups came to America, they were going to become Methodists, right? And that didn't work out, but that's really part of what's happening in this period. Growth in the United States population since the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 has been from a lot of non-Christian contexts in Africa and Asia and the Middle East, as well as historically Catholic contexts like Central and South America. So no one should have expected Protestants, of all people, to be gaining lots and lots of the new people who were coming to the United States. But the continued growth of secular outlooks in the Western culture since the 1700s has continued to affect us as well. Now, this question, are the evangelicals drawing members from us, has been investigated by a guy. I don't know if you met him. He was he was at Duke, but not in the divinity school. Mark Chaves. He's a sociologist, and he wrote a book called Contemporary American Religion, Contemporary Trends, published in 2011. And what he shows is that, yes, in the period of the 1980s through the 1990s, evangelical churches, including the new mega churches of that period, were growing very much. But what he found is that there's little evidence of mainline flight from old line churches to evangelical churches. To their credit, these evangelical churches were tending to pick up people who were not religiously affiliated, and in some cases, evangelicals were actually coming over to mainline churches, and Mark Chaves has documented that. There is evidence now of evangelical church decline in the last 2 or 3 decades. Mega churches have faced very significant issues with transitions from their founding pastors like Robert Schuller and his Crystal Cathedral. You know what it is now in, where is it? Anaheim, right? It's now a Catholic cathedral, the Crystal Cathedral, and that's a kind of sign of what's going on in religion. So some successful evangelical groups have begun to look more mainline in the last 40 years. I like to use the example of the largest Christian congregation in the whole world, the Yoido Full Gospel Church in Seoul. It's a Pentecostal church. So I'm ready. Sunday morning, I've got a flight that evening out of Seoul, Incheon Airport, and I have got my coffee, my Starbucks there in Seoul, and I thought, this is the biggest church in the world. I ought to go look at it. So I walk in, and they start giving me English language translators and all kinds of fun stuff. What's going on? Ministers in clergy robes with stoles. They've got a fabulous choir, and it's singing, and they're singing in Korean. Da, 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 da. They're singing classic old Protestant hymns. They've got an altar, candlesticks. It's very, dare I say, high church? I mean, it didn't look like Pentecostals in Beaumont, right? They were not screaming and shouting, and so they were speaking in tongues actually, but they speak in tongues not like this, but like sort of like this, you know. It was like it was cool. Really, it was an interesting experience. So the evangelical groups that survive become more mainline looking. That I think is worth thinking about. It's been demonstrated that old line Protestants were never a majority of Americans. That's the myth we've been living up with for decades and decades and decades. It's simply not true. And Kevin Cruz, One Nation Under God, that's Billy Graham on the cover there, but he's sort of making that point that it was not normative to be a member of a Protestant church or any other church community for that matter. Now, studies in worship attendance show a very similar trend. So I've tried to put together stats from the 4 denominations for which I could find studies. And this is difficult. It's easy for me to find United Methodist attendance figures. We're obsessed with figures and stuff, and I know where to find them in our library. But for the Episcopal Church in the USA, that's the first line there, I had to go over to the bishop's office and look at what they call the Red Book every year, and at a certain point they've got a table that shows attendance. And I've got the ELCA Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Presbyterian Church in the USA, the United Methodist Church, which you'll see is by far the largest of these denominations. And what it comes around to is that in about 1990, about 7 million people were worshiping every week in these 4 denominations. Right at 7 million in 1995, 2007.1. There's actually a little rise at that point. Then down to 6,660,000, and down to 5.8 million in 2010. So yes, there is a decline. But if you put all that together into a chart, it's gonna, well, I don't have that in a chart. 2010, the press was reporting about something that sociologists had found out that they called the halo factor about weekly worship attendance. Now, you knew this, okay? But they thought that 40% of Americans went to church every Sunday morning. Can you imagine Dallas if 40% of the population of Dallas went to church every Sunday morning? Can you imagine what Central Expressway would look like, or Northwest Highway or something like that? We all knew that wasn't true. It turns out that our church membership and attendance records were much more accurate than what people said when they called them on the phone and said, do you go to church? Of course I go. I go every week, you know. That's what they call the halo factor. You remember going to church, but they're not going to church. So the more recent studies showed that only about 21% of Americans were going to worship every week. And that would show something like a 50% drop-off from the 1940s, when it really was about 40% of Americans. And so people report themselves as attending church weekly, when in reality they haven't attended regularly for a long, long time. The implication for the old line Protestant churches, yes, we followed that trend, but our rate of loss of weekly attendance is not at all as so steep as the overall almost 48% loss since the 1940s. Here's the United Methodist Church from 1976 through 2010, and what you can see is, here's the membership drop, okay? That's pretty serious, right? Not the cataclysmic thing that they had envisioned. But here's worship attendance, and worship attendance is pretty steady. It even went up between 1996 and 2000, and then has come down a little bit more since that time. I think that's a realistic estimate of what's really going on. in American religion in this period. In fact, if you estimate active membership, and that's hard to estimate, this is what the picture looks like. So what you've got up here is the actual membership of these churches, these 4 denominations, and then their worship attendance is like this. What I think is really happening is this is the solid core, and y'all know who they are in your church here. You know you've got that much membership, percentage-wise, that is never coming and probably will not come back until they die, and somebody in their family says, oh, my daddy was a member of this church, so you're expected to do his funeral and say nice things and so forth about him. But that's reality, folks. I think if you remember nothing else, remember this graphic here. That's real attendance. That's, people whose names are on the rolls. And I'll say a little more about that as I go along. Weekly attendance has been the primary statistic indicating active membership. Evidence more impressionistic than documented that many active families actually attend far less now than they did 20 or 30 years ago. Sunday is a day when they actually schedule Little League practice and stuff like that, which never, ever happened in Beaumont, Texas when I was growing up there. But Sunday is not the day that it used to be. I think we need to redefine active membership. My colleague at SMU, Alexis McCrossan, has written a book called Holy Day Holiday, The American Sunday, and she documents this change in Sunday that's been happening through the decades. I think another big factor is the passing of the generation that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, my parents' generation, where you just went to meetings. You just went. You went to Rotary, and you went to Lions, and you went to Ruritan and Civitan, and you went to the PTA. Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, 1999, sort of showed us what was happening. Bowling alone. Why? Because people used to go bowling in leagues, and by 1999 they just went by themselves to the bowling alley. But he's saying people no longer wanted to do things together, right? They just want to do things by themselves or in their nuclear family unit, and I think that's something that's behind the attendance figures. There are some new trends. I think they're not spectacular. One is that you can see that headline, about 3 in 10 adults now religiously unaffiliated. That's 2021. In 2021 also, the nuns continued to rise. That's that gray line down there at the bottom. And an interesting thing, the most recent one in 2020, actually in 2021 also, was that they find a slight decline in the younger religiously unaffiliated group, and also a slight, I don't think I've got this on here, but let me, okay, here's where I'm going. Now, this is complete stereotyping. Okay, I take all the credit for it and the blame for it, but what does it mean to say people are not religiously affiliated? Okay, it changes generationally. In my generation, we graduated from high school in 1972. If you ask people, what is your religious affiliation, they would tell you where they went to church when they were a kid. If you ask people today, they will tell you different. So here's my stereotype. This is Larry, born in 1953, raised as a Lutheran, not me. Religious activity, none. Church attendance, none. Church giving, none. And he describes himself as a Lutheran. Here's Debbie, born in 1954, like somebody else in this room. Raised as a Baptist, religious activity is none, church attendance is none, church giving is none, and describes herself as Baptist. Here's Kai. She or he was born in 1984, not quite sure what her sexual identity is going to be yet. Raised as a Pentecostal, religious activity is none, church attendance is none, church giving is none, describes him or herself as religiously unaffiliated. Here's Skylar, born in 1986. These are the 2 years our daughters were born, by the way. He's raised as a Jehovah's Witness. His religious activity is none. His church attendance is none. His church giving is none. And he describes himself as religiously unaffiliated. What's common between them? None of these group that I'm highlighting has any religious activity whatsoever. But what's the difference between them? The ones of my generation describe themselves as Lutheran or Baptist or Methodist or something because that's where they went when they were a kid. The newer ones, frankly, are just more honest about religion. And that's not entirely a bad thing. It's just that when you hear all these people are religiously unaffiliated, frankly, a lot of my contemporaries were religiously unaffiliated in the sense that they never went to church, but they wouldn't admit it. They would say, yeah, we were Methodist, we were Baptist, we were Lutheran, something like that. So you got to keep that in mind, I think. A more very recent study shows a slight rise in white mainline Protestants and a slight decline in white evangelical Protestants. I'm not sure how important that's going to be. We'll just see if it follows. But United Methodist Church has tried to respond after decades of feeling that we had overbuilt churches in the 1950s and 60s, the post-war generation. The United Methodist Church began developing new congregations from the 1980s and beyond, and this has morphed into creative new missional outreach, including what's called Fresh Expressions. And one of the Fresh Expressions guys is at Perkins now and leading, where they're having a pub church or they're having a pub group that meets and talks about religion or something without sort of presupposing it's going to morph into a church or something like that. I got two anecdotal things I'm going to say here, just coming to the end. In the summer of 1976, remember the bicentennial of the United States in the summer of 1976? It was hot in Pasadena, Texas, and the pastor gave me a wonderful assignment. This is the most genius pastor I ever got the chance to work with. Bob said, okay, what I want you to do is the church secretary is going to give you a list of people who have never attended church in the last 5 years. Go visit them, see what's going on. I spent the summer visiting the loveliest people in the world in Pasadena, Texas, and they would tell me, oh, we're so glad to see you. We joined that church when such and such was the minister, and our kids were little, and they went to all these activities there, but they've grown up and gone away, and we don't have any friends there anymore. It was very clear they weren't coming back to church. They weren't interested at all, but they were lovely, lovely folks. And while I was there, in fact, the very first week I was there, Brother Bob Joyner, wonderful man, gave me a card, and he grinned, and he said, here's something I'm going to let you take care of because you're the youth minister. I was the youth minister, and it said, it's from a girl in the congregation. She's 17, and it says, we used to have these little things that you filled out every week, and you could have a box that you could check, and it said, I desire to talk to a minister. You got, see there? Okay, great. Well, she checked that, and so he hands it to me. I go over to talk to her. What is it? She says, well, I grew up in Beaumont, and my church had confirmation at this year, and I got to Pasadena, and they had church confirmation at another year, and I never was confirmed. So, great. I said, well, let's think about this. And I came back to Bob, and I said, here's the issue. And Bob said, now this is the real stroke of genius. He got the church secretary to go through all the church records and find out how many youth in our church, high school age, had never been confirmed. She came up with 75 names out of the 1,600-member church who are high school students, never been confirmed. I contacted them. I said, how many of you would like to have a special confirmation class for high school students? Folks, this was the most serious confirmation class I've ever seen. These folks had been worried about this, really, and they did incredible stuff. They snuck out of their home to go to these meetings that we had at church. They told their mother they were going to the library or something like that, and they came to church, imagine. And one of the boys' mother died the Easter morning that we were going to confirm them and make their profession of faith, and he said he's going to be there because that's where his mother would want him to be that morning. And when these two girls got up who had been sneaking away from their mom on Thursday nights to come to confirmation class, their mother started weeping because she finally realized what the daughters were doing when they were coming out. It was just, I think there is nothing in the books anywhere that says you need to confirm people at 6th grade or 7th grade or something like that. I think we're making a big mistake about that. But what I think is that in that great period that we kind of lionize as the greatest period of growth in Methodism, we weren't forming people very well. We were not catechizing people strongly as Christians, and it shows. So that what looks like a great period of growth really turns, and I think that's why that graph shows the drop-off. What's really happening is just people are dying off who never came to church anyway, and most of the folks in the church had never heard from them. So I think that's what's going on. Are we there yet? It is not the kingdom of God yet, in case you haven't heard. But the rumors of the death of old-line churches are not to be trusted. That's the main thing I want to say. The press has not got that memo. I've tried to send it to them. They're not responding because it's not the story that they had been fed. But does that make sense to y'all? Really, it's not great news. It's not saying there is no decline. I'm just trying to say what's the really good news is, like people who would show up at Cochran Chapel on Sunday evening or Monday evening or Tuesday evening, there's a strong core of active, believing folks in these congregations. Yes, Beth?
I was going to say that for those people who are not members of our congregation, y'all don't know that my son actually got confirmed when he was 17.
Okay.
COVID hit.
Right.
Kind of like a major drop-off.
That makes sense, yeah.
Youth attendance here.
Yep.
We had a shift in personnel teaching him. And when he finally got confirmed, pardon me if I get the words wrong, but our pastor said that Daniel actually knew more going and being confirmed as a 17-year-old.
Oh, I completely believe it, yeah.
Than as a 13-year-old who was just like nodding and smiling and doing this stuff
Right,
and checking the boxes.
Every time I'm asked to speak to a younger confirmation class, I think it's not anything like that high school group that I had. I think there's no reason why the discipline does not require you to do this at any particular point. Ron. This is my friend Ron. He's one of my groupies from Lover's Lane. Yeah.
I have a couple of good friends who are atheists, but their wives are very religious.
Okay.
I don't know how that fits in your
No, I don't know how it fits either, but probably, I would guess, in the 1940s or 50s, the atheists would have come to church every now and then. They would have just sat there grumpy or something like that, which would have been good. I wish they'd come every now and then. But the same phenomenon that led to people people saying they were not religiously affiliated also let people just say, we're not going. There's a great Norman Rockwell picture. It's a Sunday morning picture, and it's the mother has got all the kids lined up to go to Sunday school, and the father is hiding behind the newspaper, and he's obviously got his pajamas on. Some kind of phenomenon like that, I think, was going on even back in what we lionize as the golden days, you know.
Where do non-denominational churches fit in?
Okay, where do non-denominational churches fit? Most of them are part of what we call the evangelical churches. Some of those, I would say, in a sense, they have a similar phenomenon. So, for example, this mega church in the Chicago suburbs, Willow Creek Community Church, if you read anything about it in the recent years, the pastor had problems with inappropriate sexual relationships. Surprise, surprise. See, these independent churches, they have no vetting of clergy. They can just hire anybody off the street who says they're inspired by God to preach or something like that. And so they don't have the kind of heavy process. Maybe we're over-processed, but we have a heavy process where you background checks and all kinds of stuff like that. We've got a similar case here in the Dallas area right now, right? This big mega church. So what I want to say, though, is we actually sent students out from Garrett to visit and see how they do things. Well, Sunday morning is completely designed for unbelievers. It is not what y'all do on Sunday morning, what we do at Lover's Lane. It's designed, it's a party. It's the first thing you see is the food court when you walk in, right? It's like going to the mall. No, it was like going to the mall in the 80s when people went to the mall, right? And Wednesday night is their core group where they do serious formation of Christians, and that's kind of what I would say that's the red line at the bottom, and the people who come on Sunday mornings for the big show are the kind of the fluff on the top of the pie or something like that there. So yeah, they tend to be evangelical, but the more a church grows, I think the more traditional it becomes, actually. You realize that to make a religious movement last, you've got to have processes, you've got to have ways of handing on the faith from one generation to another.
In your research, did you get any numbers on the Church of Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, I did not include them as Christian churches. Now, that's very debatable. They want to be Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they have religious views that are so different. I presume they're a growing group, though. I think so. And my understanding is they've developed tremendous family resources and financial resources as well. So a lot to be commended about some of the stuff that they do. Yeah.
I think that your research assumption about the reason for declining members, but not even really declining, we're kind of just the active members are still
the active member. You've got a strong core, right?
That the active members when I was growing up I was born in '91.
Yep.
And so Don Anders taught me how to be an acolyte in the church.
Yay.
And that traditional aspect, passing like the reasons why we do certain things and why it's important to do those candles and stuff, that it becomes more traditional as it goes on is very fascinating.
When you move from one generation to another, you have a tradition, right? That's almost what tradition means. It means what you hand on from one generation to another. Yes, one more, and then I'm going to try to close. Yep.
And I was really surprised at how few people had any current religious connection and affiliation. But they had all been raised in some
Yes, right.
tradition.
Right, yeah. So it's interesting. One of the things Catholics do, and I think this is something Methodists also see, but it's come home for Christmas, and they want you to come to Mass at Christmas, and they'll have a special Mass for people who really haven't been active at church, and I think there's an idea we could make fly. You know, have a church for people who are suspicious of church or something like that. Yeah, yeah.
We call it Christmas cantata.
Christmas in what?
Cantata.
Christmas cantata. Yeah, something like that.
Do you see Methodism, when you're talking about what we do on Sunday is,
Yep.
is really a turn off to a lot of people?
Yep.
Because I have a lot of people in my life that are, 40s and 50s, and I had dinner with a couple of them this weekend, and they call me the church lady, and I'm just fine with that. But we had a serious conversation about that. I said, if we felt more of the community, I might come.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So it's made me really think since then,
Mm.
how do we make that community? It's not probably on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Where people who,
Yeah.
I think from my encounters with people over the last year, a real desire for the people 40s and 50s who were confirmed at 12 or 13, and they might go to church at Easter and Christmas.
Yeah.
They still have a real desire
I-
for community.
I
and
know
don't
that,
how to
yeah.
build it.
I think that's true. Yeah, if we could find a way to tap into that. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Chuck.
So Ted mentioned fresh expressions, which I think gets to this idea
Yes, that's
that,
right.
these might be our friends who bring dessert. Exactly.
Dessert, yeah. And all the people said.
Hello, come in.
Oh yeah, I think it's coming.
doors of the church, and we did not expect pie to come to us, but there we are. Friends, thank you. It's been a fascinating presentation. I think all church historians should be from Southeast Texas and learn to tell stories. Yeah. So we will have more interesting conversation tomorrow, and I hope that the conversation will continue. So part of what we believe in as Methodists is that we put our faith in action. It's not enough for us just to come to worship on Sunday morning and read our Bibles on a daily basis, but that we are changed by that experience of grace that we hear about and receive in the sacrament on Sunday mornings. So it has become a tradition among us that on Sunday night we pack food boxes for the Children's Hunger Fund, which means that due to our labors tonight, 200 families will receive a food kit that will include spaghetti, noodles and sauce, canned vegetables, canned tuna, peanut butter, fruit bars, etc. The plan throughout the week was to have all of this neatly laid out so you could just come and go through the line. But all of you are veterans of Vacation Bible School for Adults. You know how this has to happen. Many of you, dear saints that you are, just knew to put the food out. There's probably still a little food that we need to put out. But you know the drill, so I'm not going to go through it in any detail. Most of the items, particularly if they're larger, we need one each. One bag of spaghetti noodles, one can of tomato sauce, one, until we get to the smaller things, the fruit bars and the fruit chews. There are more of them required, but we have labeled that on the tables. The goal, which is entirely contrary to human nature, the goal is to move through slowly. I say this every year, and every year my dreams don't come true. But we're people of hope, so I'm going to keep hoping that we will do this well. Right? Just move through slowly, chat with your neighbor, share the love of Christ with the person you're going through the line with. Right? Don't reach over them. Just be patient. Take your turn. We will pack the boxes. Clearly, Chance's pies are here already. They will be waiting for us. It's going on for 7:45. I think we can pack most everything in 15 or 20 minutes. Again, we don't have to rush. If we take our time, there are 25, 30 of us. 200 boxes can get put together by 8 o'clock when the goal is to eat pie. Yes? We're going on to perfection. We're going on to dessert. We're going downstairs. One more round of applause for Ted Campbell, and I'll see everyone downstairs. All right, you are dismissed. Elevator or the stairway?